and acting head of the Non-Traditional Security Studies Center at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. May I now hand over the floor to Dr. Emmers, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I trust you enjoyed your lunch as well as the keynote address by President Kalam. It's now giving me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second panel discussion on new directions in global governance. The panel will examine the accelerating pace and changing conditions of globalization, leading, as we all know, towards ever more complex forms of interdependence. It will seek to review a series of transnational challenges and question whether a new form of global governance is emerging to address them. I will encourage the panelists to seek to identify innovative ways of developing governance mechanisms to ensure order and justice. I will also encourage them to try to address a series of rather fundamental questions when examining the global governance question. First, is global governance really in sight? Secondly, what kind of governance should one expect to emerge in the years to come? More specifically, how will decisions be taken in such a system? Who will lead the process, in other words? Finally, how can we guarantee the legitimacy and accountability of such a global governance process? Now, we are very fortunate this afternoon to have 4 renowned speakers who have all tackled those questions both conceptually but also empirically through first-hand experiences. I will introduce them to you very briefly, as you can find their extended biographies in the conference booklet. On my extreme right, Dr. H.S. Dillon is the Presidential Special Envoy for Poverty Alleviation, Republic of Indonesia. He has held numerous positions in and outside of the Indonesian government and is currently a member of the National Economic Committee. Mr. Nabil Fahmy is presently the founding dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. He served as Egyptian ambassador to the United States from 1999 to 2008, as well as to Japan from 1997 to 1999. Mr. Yoshiji Nogami is the president of the Japan Institute of International Affairs. He served as Japanese ambassador to the United Kingdom from 2004 to 2008, as well as to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. Finally, last but certainly not least, Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a member of the Indian Parliament and a former Indian Minister of State for External Affairs. Dr. Tharoor also had an illustrious career at the United Nations, including as senior advisor to the Secretary General. I would like to invite the panelists to limit their remarks to 12 minutes so as to leave ample time for the question and answer session. And with no further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Dillon to start.
Thank you, Rob. It is evident that the extant institutions are proving incapable of satisfactorily addressing the increasing complexity and interconnectedness of the issues confronting international community. Ideally, actually, with independence comes easier communication, identification of common problems, and finding win-win solutions. But the inherent assumption there is that there is trust between all the parties involved, based on a widely accepted consensus. In actuality, there is serious asymmetry in development and state capacity to formulate and implement policy. So, nation-states may be connected and complementary, but also tend to be competitive, in dissonance with greater goals. Also, with interdependence comes the feeling of insecurity instead of threat. Governance is decided by the quality of institutions. And just like many other institutions, the governance institutions also become fossilized. The triple disaster, food and energy, sharp escalation in prices of food and energy, climate change and the financial meltdown are very good examples of the failure of global governance. Let us examine one after another. What we see here in the food, it started with developed countries, industrial countries wanting to have food sovereignty. So they gave support prices. After support, they had to give a stockpile. Stockpiles became big. Export subsidies. Low food prices. No investment in developing countries because the return of investment was so small. Impoverished farmers and left them without the capacity to produce even when prices came up. All right? Now, there has been polarization of income. You can see Doha. It's called a development round. It was meant to correct this wrong after the Uruguay round, but the development round did not provide policy space for developing countries to climb up the value chain. Energy. You know what the energy market is like. It's Qatar-like and everything. The financial meltdown as this revolving door governance, bailouts, cut social services. During the Bush era, we had all the surplus done away by waging war and the Bush tax cuts. Now we have a Buffett tax there. But evidence shows that policies which do not favor the rich have very great little difficulty in passing in what we have seen democracies with state capture. Climate change. Climate change, in fact, comes from the whole idea of go forth and multiply. They say the world is yours. So the whole idea here, destroying mankind, is the idea that man is master. And that is why we saw all this. What we have seen is that actually, long time ago, Boulding had said that we are fellow travelers on spaceship Earth. Actually, the avian flu proved that, because you cannot allow developing countries to fester, because whatever happens there eventually is going to come to you. Well, we have tried. We had, as I told you, Doha. We had the MDGs, very good intents, but not followed through with commitments. We had Kyoto. Right now, we have a crisis. A crisis occurred because there has been denial for too long. We have not been willing to address issues as they rise. There is time for creative destruction. The destruction is there. It's time to be creative. Last night, we were told about shifting landscapes, terrorism, cyber warfare, even in my country, in Ambon. Now, what we need is continuous rebalancing at the national level between state, market, and society. At the global level, it should be between multilateral institutions, international corporations, and what I call netizens, citizens of the net. We have seen, why do you need constant rebalancing? Otherwise, you have one party controlling all the others. So, cyber society, I've seen Awaz, I think must be Indian, that has been very effective in galvanizing support, in petitioning and all that. Now, what we had seen a long time ago was that Drucker had said there is a decoupling. There is growth without creating the commensurate employment needed. Now, we will see that conflict is coming to the youth. Youth emerging out of poverty, but also youth, it is affected because they are the ones who are facing major unemployment there. Now, what do we need? It's interesting. You have said that we should have innovative. Quite interesting that 50 years ago, Sukarno went to the UN and offered them in his speech to build the world anew. Mind you, 50 years ago, Sukarno had identified what forces would emerge. He had said what you see now, the BRICS. The BRICS now are what he had called new emerging forces at that time. And he offered them Pancasila. What he wanted at that time was an order, a world order, based on what he called humanity that is just and civilized. But you can see now when he came out with that, they said, oh, he is against the powers that be. What he was asking for at that time in 1960 was, do not treat developing countries as newly independent countries as colonies. But even as we speak today, we can see how much pressure is being brought to bear upon the Palestine statehood quest. Clearly, a telltale sign of how little things have changed over this last 50 years. What sort of institutions shall you really evolve? The point is, in governance, you have to have transparency. You have to have real, actual participation, and from that too, then you can get accountability. So right now, I think we should tap regional forums to identify points of insecurity across countries, and in ways which these regional forums, where quid pro quo is easier, they wish to mitigate the insecurity. Challenge individual countries listed as new economic powers like the BRICS, G20, to come up with proposals to embrace and handle the findings from regional forums. Utilize ICT to really map out all the conditions of your citizens. But what President Kalam was saying, the UN Security Council, last year Tomiko was speaking about here, where because they had no immediate interest, the Security Council allowed genocide to continue in Rwanda. So unless the Security Council in one way or another represents humanity, then it is going to be very difficult. I, at the end, would like to paraphrase one of the few times that I agree with him. I hope I can find him. Yeah. The Pope, Benedict XVI, just spoke on the eve of the 10th anniversary of September 11, and I paraphrase, he said, "It's my fervent prayer that a firm commitment to justice and a global culture of solidarity will help rid the world of the grievances that so often give rise to acts of violence and will create the conditions for greater peace, prosperity, offering a brighter and much secure future." Adam Smith had talked about enlightened self-interest. Mill said that it needed intellectual maturity. Now, I am afraid, Ralph, that the Mayans were onto something when they stopped their calendar 2012. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for doing it within the time. I think you've started by setting a rather pessimistic tone, and we'll see whether this is shared by the other panelists. Let me now invite Ambassador Fahmy.
Thank you, Rob. You know, coming from the Middle East and being asked to talk about global governance and what needs to be done is a bit taxing, particularly at this point in time in the Middle East while we're trying to get our own house in order. But I'm doing it for several reasons. First of all, I've been trying to push in the Middle East a greater focus on Asia, and therefore I'm very supportive and appreciative of the invitation from RSIS to come here and speak. And secondly, because I think that whether we're in the Middle East or here in Asia, we all need to speak out and get engaged in the process. The system of governance we have today is not a bad system, it's just outdated. The reality is it was established at the right time, and I think what they established there, essentially around the UN, was the best that they could actually do given the circumstances of the time. I don't think we need to prove them wrong or necessarily to destroy what we have. We need to build and develop on it to get a better achievement. And having gone through many GA and different resolutions of the UN, I'd simply like to draw you back quickly to, we always tended not to read the preambles and focus on the operative parts of the paragraphs of the resolutions. In fact, the preambles very frequently reflected the aspirations and the operative part, what we could do at the time. If you read the preamble of the UN Charter, it talks about us, the people. It talks about the greater good of mankind. Those are the true aspirations. The provisions were meant to actually get it started, moving towards that goal given reality. So it was realpolitik with hope and idealism. And I want to commend the UN for what it's done over the years. Now, we need to build on that. It was 60-odd states. We're now about 3 times the size of that. It was based on a balance of power post-World War II. The balance of power is different now, and because I was asked by Ralph to be provocative, I actually think that the focus on the balance of power is intellectually and politically wrong, because we need to look at global governance not from a balance of power perspective, because that reflects a conflict perspective. It needs to be looked at from a balance of interest perspective, which is more in line with multilateralism. So on the one hand, we need to define what power actually means. We need to take into account the balance of power, and we need to look at the different different actors, state or non-state. But I would argue again, the whole concept of how we achieve this has to change from what it was to what it is today. In preparing for this, I looked at a number of charts and facts and figures, and one of them on international institutions, which would be the tools of global governance, was quite interesting. It was by the Pew Research Center. And to my amazement, they surveyed about 25 different countries. The majority of the industrialized Western world was actually supportive of international institutions, which is including the US, which had a 61% positive rating, which I found quite surprising. But the fact is, the public at least supports international institutions quite significantly in the developed world, while depending on the regional conflicts, the public in the developing world seems to be less supportive. There's also another perception which is interesting and but wrong. The same poll surveyed who the world thought was the leading economic power. And 7 out of 21 countries, in those countries, the public said China. So, and I mention this not to challenge the figures, but reality occasionally is perceptions. And if you're going towards trends and shifts, it's important to look at what people believe. Now, of course, as was said this morning, China has grown very significantly vis-a-vis the US over the years. But that the most of the world, that a significant portion of the world thinks it's already the reigning economic power is interesting. Another question was, well, is the growth of China militarily good or bad vis-a-vis the US? And I mentioned China specifically because we're in Asia, not because I'm sort of focused on China from the Middle East. Believe me, I have other concerns. 8% in the US, for example, felt this competition was not useful militarily. Same applied in the, I'm sorry, 8% it was good. 85% it was not good. The same thing went on throughout most of the Western world, while if you moved towards middle countries, neither here, neither in the West nor in Asia, they tended to be more positive. The Asian countries tended to be a little bit here, a little bit there. Another interesting scheme was how much confidence people had in world leaders. And the reason I mention this is because I'm trying to show the distortion, really, of the vision of the world. First of all, the question put by Pew named 4 leaders. Not a single one from Asia, Africa, or Latin America. They were Obama, Merkel, Sarkozy, and Medvedev. So the idea that world leaders are only these 4 leaders is in itself a reflection of what's wrong with global governance. And I just mentioned this more than the actual figures because the figures are completely political. You can see where the support or the opposition is coming from. In terms of defining power in the future, I think a great point to focus on is, frankly, education. Education is, in my mind, going to be one of the strongest components of power, and I say this, it's going to be power in a positive sense, because it is the backbone of research and technology, it's the backbone of development, as well as the backbone of some really crazy military security theory. But you can't get only good results from an asset. So, and again, if you look at the figures in terms of the promotion of education, you see a very strong positive trend towards education in Asia. Now, another issue, of course, will be natural resources. Who has the resources, who needs them, and who's competing for them? And the typical resources are energy and foodstuffs. And you see this whether you're looking at where the emerging states are moving towards in their relations, or in terms of where many of the conflicts that exist in this region seem to be emerging. If you don't look at natural resources, there's no logical reason why there's so much international interest in some of these sub-regional conflicts. Now, I come from the Middle East, and I'm sure you expect me to say something about the Middle East. So let me just say the first thing is we need some time to get our own house in order. That being said, we will be more and more a voice to be heard because we're being driven, and the reform process is being driven mostly by demographics. 56% of our population in Egypt, for example, is 25 years and younger. If you look at that at the 30-year level, regionally, it's 65%. 24% of those are unemployed. Add to that poverty, regional conflict, the search for identity, which is an important element as well. You see the reasons for the volatility, for the anger, for the anxiety. But that being said, I am generally quite positive towards what's happening in the Middle East. I'm quite confident we will ultimately succeed. I'm not sure when, however, and how many mistakes we will make on the way, because this is a process where we're trying to change all of society. But if I was focused on, if I was an international player, or at least interested in the international community as you are, I would focus on the Middle East. There's a tremendous, it will play a different role in the future. It will either be much more assertive in conflict creation or I'm not sure we can do that, by the way, or in trying to solve conflicts. Now, what needs to be done to move forward? And I'll close with those issues because I know there are other important speakers. If we're looking at global governance, again, my basic point is our concept has to be a balance of interests. It can't be simply a balance of power. That's not going to be, that'll be simply changing the players, but not changing the norms for global governance. Secondly, if I had to choose global issues, not the regional issues closest to my heart, but global issues, they would be nuclear proliferation, environmental protection, poverty reduction, and sustainable development. These are the issues which I think will define politics and governance globally much more than other issues. Again, let me emphasize, it does not mean, however, that there will not be other issues. I'm just saying, if I had to choose, that is what would best determine the governance foundation or the paradigm. Now, in my concluding remarks, now what needs to be done? For the third time, it's a balance of interest paradigm rather than a balance of power paradigm. Secondly, we have to take into account, well, let me just make this point across here. I listened this morning to a lot about deterrence theory, or at least something about deterrence theory. And I don't want to open the debate on deterrence theory, but even if it was useful in the past, and I will occasionally question that, I'm not sure it even fits as a security theory for the future. If you don't have symmetrical threats from major poles, if you're looking at multidimensional asymmetrical threats, I'm not sure you can achieve security through deterrence, and it's much more useful to try to achieve security through a set of cooperative measures and active diplomacy. What needs to be done by way of governance? As we promote democracy domestically, it's important to promote democracy internationally. Our global governance mechanisms, and the professor just mentioned one of them, the UN, has to be more democratic, reflective of today's situation. And the Security Council was just one example, but I can mention others. Accountability, transparency, and the rotation of power. Those are three components that are extremely important in what we develop. I would also throw out two more things and then close these comments. I think it's extremely important to have more interregional consultations. I've noticed, for example, and I support this, we've had India-Africa consultations, China-Africa consultations, but very little consultations between groupings in different parts of the world. I think that's very important if we're looking at a multipolar world with a wide-ranging interest. It's important to understand each other and create common interests. And the reason I say it's important to understand each other is, frankly, we don't have time to think if we're going to be reactive to conflict. So it's important for us, given how short time has become, if we're going to make rational responses, we have to have a basic understanding. My last point is, while I was in Washington, I was quite anxious about the preemptive use of force theories. I would suggest that what we need to promote is preemptive diplomacy rather than preemptive use of force, or at least in parallel to that, and that would require a much more robust, flexible system within the UN, which wouldn't necessarily mean internationalizing every issue. It would, however, mean in energizing the UN and regional organizations in engaging states where there are conflicts to help solve the problems without making it an international problem. So preemptive diplomacy for me is a very important component if we're looking at stability in the future. Thank you very much, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fahmy. And I note your call for building on what we have and trying to do so through a balance of interest perspective. Without wanting to preempt the question, I suspect that later on you will always also be asked to see whether a particular vote that may or may not happen tomorrow at the Security Council and how that could influence governance, particularly in the Middle East. Let me now invite Ambassador Nogami to share his thoughts with us.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be able to participate in this discussion. I suppose Barry Desker invited me to join in this panel because I'm very skeptical about the current narratives on this global governance issue, particularly the general tone of narratives in Asia. It is true that the world financial and economic crisis accelerated the international debate on the global governance. Well, this is partly due to the realization that policy coordination amongst the major advanced economies alone would not avert economic catastrophe. G7 or G8 were seen to be something of the past. Some like Gordon Brown or Nicolas Sarkozy started talking about new Bretton Woods institutions. Some even talked about G2, hence G20. G20 is, in fact, a Canadian product, and very few people have forgotten about it, and I will come back to this point later. The G20 process certainly worked in its first stage. Washington, Pittsburgh, and London produced some tangible results, although some of those results have been already forgotten by most of the G20 members. For instance, very important declaration on the strong, balanced, and sustainable growth. This document contains many points Peter Mandelson this morning talked about. But nonetheless, I will come back to this point again later. However, as recovery appeared to be setting in some countries, particularly in Asia, while others struggled, the policy coordination became more and more difficult. Toronto process produced less, and in fact, Seoul process revealed a wide gap existing amongst members. President Obama named it as a World Premier Economic Forum, but it has thus far failed to become a global governance structure. They have not they have not found shared objectives. In Washington, Pittsburgh, London, yes, there was a shared objective to avert the economic meltdown. But since, as the economy started showing some recovery, this shared objective is lost. The post-Second World War institutions, such as Bretton Woods institutions, which were often mentioned in this meeting, were intended to be instruments of what the political scientists may call hegemonic stability. Hegemon sets out rules, binds itself with those rules, undertakes cost of running the system. What we are seeing now is a process of erosion of such hegemonic stability. Perhaps such erosion was accelerated by the world economic crisis and or outstretch of the hegemon in the process such as the war on terror. Although post-Second World War governance structure were fairly robust, because there were a number of countries, a number of like-minded countries, which share the same objectives with the hegemon and support the hegemon, those like-minded countries were also seriously damaged by the economic crisis. However, apart from tackling the economic crisis, the G20 has not established such shared objectives and shared responsibilities. In Seoul, for instance, they lost the opportunity to become a global policy coordinating body. The fundamental problem we are facing today is that the countries which have been supporting the global governance structure are either politically dysfunctional domestically or economically fatigued, while those emerging economies, emerging powers, are still simply trying to maximize their individual interest and have not been able to put forward their vision of global governance structure. Kishore Mahbani may disagree to this point, but so far they have failed to present a sort of acceptable vision of the new structure. We do not, for instance, we do not know whether those emerging powers are status quo seekers or revisionist powers. They have not even mentioned this aspect. They have benefited from the existing governance structure, but not prepared to shoulder the cost of repairing the already sort of fatigued system. the lack of the vision improving the system also is not presented. The vision of the perception of some of those emerging powers, particularly China, is what I call neo-Westphalian concept. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference of domestic issues. In other words, global governance structure has to be something that is based on the widely acceptable values and norms. Those emerging powers are not yet capable, I underline yet, capable of providing such values and norms. It will be, unfortunately, it will be some time before they can come up with those norms and values or the set of rules. The effective governance structure implicates, in some instances, restraint of sovereignty. Domestic issues may have to be placed on the table, will have to become sometimes a subject of international policy coordination. For instance, the declaration I mentioned in Pittsburgh Declaration of strong, balanced and sustainable growth talked about the need for improving the social safety net in many countries. Social safety net such as pension schemes, the unemployment insurance schemes or health insurance schemes are basically domestic issues. And the international coordination, international debate on those quote-unquote, what is seen to be as traditionally as domestic issues, are in fact important elements of a global economic harmonization or the rebalancing. But those aspects are not yet, those emerging powers are not yet ready to put those issues on table yet. Those powers, those emerging powers, whom I call neo-Westphalian, state, this poses, the new process envisaged in this global governance structure poses some difficulty. Global governance based on the shared values and norms is, in a manner of speaking, very postmodern system where policy coordination is a sine qua non process. Those powers still confined to this neo-Westphalian concept are not ready yet to play major role in this postmodern structure. The existing structure is suffering from institutional fatigue, and those who are supposed to uphold such structures are also showing fatigue, while those emerging powers are not ready to come up with any alternative ideas, let alone playing a leadership role. My view is perhaps the most negative amongst all of us here, but this is the way I see the current situation. What do we do now? I think Nabil mentioned some interesting aspects. Yes, we have to repair the system. We have to modernize the existing system, while those emerging powers are preparing to come up with some great new ideas. We have to earn time. And in order to earn time, who is going to shoulder the system? I think many people talked about great powers, but great powers alone will not be able to sustain the structure. At the outset, I mentioned G20 is a Canadian product. Canada is not seen as a great power. Japan, which used to be second largest economy in the world, is now third, but still about the same size as Chinese economy. May be able to afford to shoulder some of the cost of those systems. We may be able to make some contribution for the world community to earn time before those emerging powers are ready to become a crucial part of this global governance structure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nogami. It seems that the pessimistic sentiment endures. You argue that we live in a neo-Westphalian world, and coming back to my three initial questions, you argue that no new form of global governance is emerging, that we have no leadership, and that the G20 seems to lack legitimacy. And I would like to point out that all of that was made from a paperless presentation based on an iPhone. So at least you are contributing to climate change alleviation. Let's see whether our last speaker, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, will now break the consensus and perhaps adopt a more positive note or agree with this co-panelist.
Thank you. Well, I was told by an old hand about public speaking in Singapore that there are three fundamental rules you mustn't break. Never exceed the time limit, never try and start a speech in Singapore with a joke, and never agree to being the fourth speaker after lunch. So since I've flunked two of the three, I'll really try and stick to the time limit. Global governance is not exactly the most precise concept dreamed up by political scientists today. It's used to describe the processes and institutions by which the world is governed, and was always intended to be an amorphous idea, since there is no such thing as a global government to provide such governance. So it's a term that tries to impose a sense of order, real or imagined, on a world without an organized system of government. And I see it as having four essential aspects. The first is history. The principal institutions of global governance today are those that emerged after the disasters of the first half of the 20th century, when the world saw 2 world wars, countless civil wars, mass expulsions of populations, and the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima. Then things changed. In and after 1945, a group of far-sighted leaders were determined to make the second half of the 20th century different from the first, and they drew up rules to govern international behavior, founding institutions in which different nations could cooperate for the common good, and that really was the root of what we today call global governance, fostering international cooperation, elaborating consensual global norms, and trying to establish predictable, universally applicable rules to the benefit of all. And the keystone of this arch, I think, was the United Nations, the institution seen by Presidents Roosevelt and Truman as the only possible alternative to the disastrous experiences of the first half of the century. An organization that would stand for a world in which people of different nations and cultures could look on each other not as subjects of fear and suspicion, but as potential partners, able to exchange goods and ideas to their mutual benefit. I'm not saying that paradise descended upon earth in 1945. We all know that tyranny and warfare have continued, that billions of people still live in extreme and degrading poverty, but the overall record of the second half of the 20th century was a lot better than the first half. Everything from child mortality to literacy to the end of colonialism, the spreading of democracy and human rights. In every one of these areas there have been significant advances, and the existence of a global system devised in 1945, I think, helped to make all of it possible. Now, these developments result at least partly from the second important feature of global governance, the emergence in the last 6.5 decades of institutions, principles, and processes that reflect this new reality. Global institutions benefit from the legitimacy, to answer the question Ralph asked at the beginning. They benefit from the legitimacy that comes from their universality. Since all countries belong to it, the UN enjoys a standing in the eyes of the world that gives its collective actions and decisions a legitimacy that no government truly enjoys beyond its own borders. But the institutions of global governance in its broadest sense have been expanding well beyond the UN. There are selective intergovernmental mechanisms like the G8 or the G20, and military alliances like NATO, regional groups like ASEAN, sub-regional groupings like the Economic Community of West African States, one-issue alliances like the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And then another span of non-political spans of activity. The writers are connecting on the international pen, soccer players in FIFA, mayors in the World Organization of United Cities and Local Governments, bankers listen to the Bank of International Settlements, and businessmen to the International Accounting Standards Board. So the process of regulating human activity above and beyond national boundaries is in fact far more widespread today than ever before. In parallel is emerging the third element of global governance, the idea that there are universally applicable norms that underpin our notion of world order and therefore of global governance. Sovereignty is one, as Yoshiji Nogami reminded us, especially in a world where the majority of states have won their sovereignty after long years of colonial rule. Emerging from this principle are related principles of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, non-aggression and coexistence, the very principles first articulated by India's Jawaharlal Nehru in his famous Panchsheel doctrine with the People's Republic of China in 1954. 8 years before the war, that kind of called some of those in question. At the same time, there has evolved a new set of global norms of governance that complement, expand, and in some cases affect these principles, including respect for human rights, transparency and accountability, rule of law, equitable development based on economic freedom, and, at least to most nations now, political democracy. These are seen as broadly desirable for all countries to aspire to, and while no one seriously suggests that they can or should be imposed on any nation, fulfilling them is seen as admirable by most of the world and broadly accepted as evidence of successful governance. The fourth feature, which again in a sense suffuses all of these, is the global nature of the determining forces of today's world. There are broadly two contending and even contradictory forces in the world in which we live today. On the one hand are the forces of convergence, the increasing knitting together of the world through globalization, modern communications and trade, and on the other, what one might call the forces of disruption, of religious polarization, of talk of the clash of civilizations, and of terrorism. The two forces, one pulling us together and the other pulling us apart, are both concurrent phenomena of our times, and they're taking place in a world in which the terrorist assaults in Mumbai on 26/11, as we call it, 26 November 2008, were in many ways emblematic, because the terrorists of 26/11 used the instruments of globalization and convergence, the ease of communications, GPS systems, mobile telephone technology, five-star hotels frequented by the transnational business elite, and so on, as instruments for their fanatical agenda. Something very similar happened, of course, on 9/11 New York, the jet aircraft crashing into those towers emblematic of global capitalism, while the doomed victims on those planes made frantic mobile telephone calls to their loved ones. So both of these are grotesque reflections of this paradoxical phenomenon. It seems to me we have no choice but to see, increasingly, even global security in all-encompassing terms. 9/11 had reminded us already of the cliché about the global village, because it proved that we're living in a village in which a fire that started in a dusty cave somewhere in Afghanistan could actually be strong enough to melt the steel girders that upheld the world's tallest skyscrapers at the other end of the global village. But that's not all. Some 2,600 people died in the World Trade Center on 9/11, but 26,000 people also died on 9/11 around the world the same day, except they died from starvation, unclean drinking water, and preventable disease. We cannot afford to exclude them from our notions of global security and global governance. So, to me, it seems to me that putting all of this together, global security will have to rest in the creation of a kind of global order that responds to both hard and soft threats, and that does so through a network of states sharing common values and compatible approaches to governance. We have to recognize both the positive and the negative forces in the world today, and obviously rest on a consciousness of the increasing mutual interdependence that characterizes our age. As somebody once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. Now, I realize these four broad aspects are descriptive of global governance rather than prescriptive. But it's clear that we just have to go well beyond earlier notions of security, accept these common phenomena that cut across borders. I used to call them in Kofi Annan's day at the UN, problems without passports. The notion that the world is full of problems that cannot be solved by any one country or any one group of countries, and which are unavoidably the shared responsibility of humankind. There's an obvious list of these problems, everything from terrorism itself to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, environment. All of these have been mentioned. I don't need to repeat them all. Mr. Dillon reminded us of epidemic disease. Remember the SARS epidemic, which the Chinese tried to confine in China, which hopped on a plane and ended up in Toronto, or AIDS, which traveled from the Congo to California and onto the world's consciousness. All of these problems without passports also call for solutions without frontiers. And that's why the idea of sovereignty is increasingly being gently modified into a notion of responsible sovereignty, the notion that sovereign nations must cooperate across borders to safeguard resources and to tackle common threats. This is also reflective of the changes in the way in which we think about security too. After 95 and after 45 and throughout the Cold War, the concept of security was taken as relating to nation states seeking to protect their territorial sovereignty and national interests from the threat or use of force by foreign powers. The security debate was always framed in terms of defense, arms build-ups, and military alliances. With the end of the Cold War and the receding prospect of superpower conflict, we now have to focus on threats based upon internal conflicts and internecine wars, civil wars, ethnic conflicts, secessionist struggles, and terrorist attacks, as well as the continuing dangers of the nuclearization of rogue states, and increasingly an awareness of the importance of human security, a notion that focuses more on the protection of the individual than on the sovereignty of the state. We had a Commission report, 2003, the report of the Commission on Human Security, which argued that in global governance today you need to protect the vital core of all human lives in ways that enhance human freedoms and human fulfillment, and added that policies and institutions must find new ways to protect individuals and communities. Some would argue that the doctrine of responsibility to protect, R2P, which has acquired controversial new life in Libya, is one such new way. Obviously, human security cannot be the pursuit of any one nation, however rich or powerful. It manifestly requires international cooperation within global bodies, as well as action by international and interstate organizations such as the UN itself. And yet we know that the UN and all these bodies rest on governance structures invented in 1945 and needing desperately to be updated in 2011. If during the Q&A any of you has questions about Security Council reform, I'll address them, but I clearly feel strongly that we do need serious reform of the Security Council if it's to be the credible body dealing with international peace and security questions. And similarly, the Bretton Woods institutions are looking increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has shifted irresistibly from the west to the east. I mean, I've got a lot more details I can go to. I do want to echo Nabil Fahmy's call for more interregional consultations. As Minister of State for External Affairs in India, I floated without much success the notion of looking beyond non-alignment to multi-alignment, arguing that countries increasingly needed to be promiscuous in the international dealings, and we had a number of different interests which manifested themselves in different configurations, so that India should belong both to the UN and to the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, both to the non-aligned movement and to the community of democracies, all of which reflected aspects of historical experience, both to the G77 and to smaller configurations like IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, or BRIC, now BRICS, with South Africa joining Brazil, Russia, India, and China. It's a way of taking advantage of an increasingly networked and globalizing world. I'm going to stop there with just one final thought that I underplayed the importance of the economic aspect. I think we'll come back to that in the discussion. But it is important to realize one thing we've learned from the recent recession is that global governance institutions really require to have a role that affects all and that supervises all, that we cannot really live on the assumption that you need institutions where the rich countries can supervise the economic delinquency of the poor. Perhaps there's a lot that the rich can learn from the poor, and that too is an insight that must be built into any reformed global governance institutions in the political sphere as well. Thank you.